Hello there, everyone. It's the professor here. As I've implied in social media posts and in talking to you about this month's episodes, it's extremely important what we're going to talk about. And you would think that I would have put extra effort into some of the more technical aspects of the recording in this show in particular. But I made a big boo-boo when recording this show with Dr. Regal, and that is I failed to record my track on our fancy recording equipment here at the Buzzkill Institute. And so what you have in the following episode is simply the audio that comes from the Zoom interview that I had with Dr. Regal. Not as good as we normally do, and our head of production did her absolute best to try to get it to sound decent. So I apologize in advance for what is going to be somewhat difficult listening. But as always, the most important thing that comes across in our shows is what our scholarly guests are able to tell us. So, enjoy.
Hello, Buzzkillers. It's quite a year. We really tackled the Columbus myths extensively in October, and today, fortunately for you, and even more fortunately for me, because I've been able to talk to him for longer about this, we're here with Dr. Brian Regal, professor at Kean University, whose new book, The Battle Over America's Origin Story, Legends, Amateurs, and Professional Historiographers, is out now, and it's just great. It has taught me so much and made me think so differently about the way popular history and popular legend is constructed. Dr. Regal, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on.
There seems to be this mania for origin stories, not only in the US, but in other countries. And it's almost as if there's a mania for origin stories that go against what's obviously right in your face. And of course, by that, I mean, in the United States anyway, Native American. Everybody you talk about in your book, almost everybody you talk about in your book, recognizes the fact that Native Americans were here, but they seem to go to absolutely extraordinary lengths to explain that, well, no, really, there were these other discoverers, and they were all European, and they were all this or all that. And they weren't what we see now meaning in the 18th, 19th century, as Indians. There has to be some, if you will, better explanation in their minds of how America started. So tell us in the beginning why you think this was so important to these people. By the way, Buzzkillers, there are, now leafing through the book here, there are 11 chapters talking about 11 different versions of America's origin story that try to explain a different non-Native American origin story before Columbus. Why does this seem so important to all these people?
Well, I think humans in general, I'm a historian, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't have the skill sets to explain all of why humans do this, but we seem to want to know where we came from. And I think in the US experience, because the US, and when I say US, I mean the people who came here who were not native people. I always get people when they see the book on my Twitter feed, it says, I know who discovered America, in a joking kind of way. And people grab a hold of that and they say, okay, well, who discovered? I said the ancestors of the Native Americans, because you can define discover in a number of different ways. And when I sat down to write this book, I said, I have to begin by understanding myself. What does discover mean? And the answer I came to was, who was here first when no one else was here? You can't discover something, I think, if when you show up, there are already people there standing on the shore watching you show up. If that's happening, you're not first. And so if we use that as a kind of a guide, the first human beings to show up in what we now call the Americas, when there was no human beings here, were the ancestors of the Native Americans. So they're the ones who discovered America. Everybody else comes later. Whatever their story is, they have come later. And I think in the U.S. context, because what we now call the United States began by having lots of people coming from different places, leaving where they were from, mostly under duress, war, famine, disease, religious persecution, whatever, and they wind up here, it requires them to psychologically, I think, come up with some kind of way of explaining what this thing is that we sort of stumbled upon. We didn't find it ourselves, but now we're going to claim it's ours. And so we got to come up with some way to explain that. And so as I was doing this book, I realized, or I recognized, that all these myths, and just so you know, there's 11 chapters. I could have made it 22 chapters.
Yeah.
I left out a bunch of stuff simply because if I included it all, it would have been one of those old 19th century 10-volume monstrosities that publishers don't do anymore.
Professor, quite frankly, you could have included a chapter on the Martians. I mean, really.
Well, Alpha Centauri, they claim that they found the Earth first, and so flying saucers, they've got some skin in the game as well, I guess. I start the book off by saying, look, the people who really discovered America are the ancestors to the Native Americans. And I'm going to accept that they're, depending upon which New World archaeologists you talk to, they arrived here anywhere from, say, 15 to 30,000 years ago. So they're the real discoverers of this thing that'll become America. But I wanted to look at and it's not a wacky story. It's a fairly straightforward story of people finding and, sprinting around. I want the wacky stories.
Right.
All of my work, I'm a historian of science. I've written books on Bigfoot, on the Jersey Devil, on pseudoscience. I teach a course at Kane on pseudoscience, and I'm fascinated by tragic characters. The search for Bigfoot, the search for the Jersey Devil, the search for who discovered America, they're just spilling over with tragic characters. People who, they go on these quests, these sad, lonely people who risk everything to prove this thing right. And in the end, they don't. When I wrote the book about the history of cryptozoology and the hunt for Sasquatch, I wanted a good opening line. You always want a good opening line when you write one of these books, because I always try to write my books like they're exciting. I want people to enjoy it and get into it. I don't want to do just a drab scholarly tome. But when I thought about, I got to come up with an opening line. And one summer, my late wife and I, we used to travel to England every summer to do, because she was a historian. We would travel to England and use all the great libraries that are over there. And we were in Oxford using the Bodleian Library there, the Harry Potter library. I needed to take a break, and I'm like fighting. What is this line? I have to have this line. And I went across the street to the Turf Tavern, one of the great bars in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sitting there, and I'm having a pint of Old Speckled Hen, trying to come up with a good line. And then it suddenly hit me. These are stories about dreams that don't come true. And that's what my Columbus book is. It's just packed full of these people who go on these crazy, wild, stupid quests that you have to be kind of crazy, wild, and stupid. Stupid in the best sense of the word, enthusiastic to prove these things, and none of them ever do it. They all fail.
Right.
So that's what attracted me to the basic concept of the story.
Well, they all fail to prove these things, but except for so many of them, they don't think they failed. They have all these people who they think they've actually proved it, and they've certainly convinced themselves to the point where, as we were talking before we started the show, Professor Eben Norton Horsford, again, one of the great 19th century names, at Harvard, goes and tries to find where Leif Erikson lived in Boston. I mean, it is amazing how far. I'm not trying to say they're deluding themselves, because they're not. Well, I suppose in one way they are, but they are really convinced that they are right and that the evidence is only there waiting to be found.
One of the interesting things that runs through all this material, I'm fascinated also in a broad sense about the relationship between professional scholars and amateur investigators.
Right.
That's really the bedrock of what I do. All these things that I've written, it all comes down to the term I use, crackpots and eggheads. And what I find so fascinating about this is you have the crackpots, and I say that in the most positive, endearing way possible.
Right.
They are convinced they are the true scholars, and that professional historians, professional archaeologists, professional linguists, they're really the ones doing mythology. They're the ones who aren't really understanding this. It's we amateurs out there in the field. We're the ones digging this stuff up, and we see it, the monumental sculptures, and we're looking at the inscriptions. The eggheads, they don't see any of this. Completely missing the point that every historian and archaeologist I ever knew spend huge amounts of time out in the field.
Sure.
For years, I tried to come up with an idea. What do I call these people?
Yeah.
Amateur doesn't really, for me, get it.
Because after all, Horsford, for instance, wasn't an amateur.
Right, he was a professional scholar, a chemist.
Yeah. Not a historian, but still.
Right, yeah, no training in history, but he was a major player in the world of 19th century chemistry, studied with Josef Liebig in Germany. He's the guy who creates baking powder, condensed milk. As far as chemistry is concerned, he's at the top of the food chain. But as far as history is concerned, he has no training whatsoever. And so I refer to these people as outsider thinkers, outsider writers, because they reject the academy, sometimes violently so, and they argue that they're the ones doing the real scholarship. These other people, they're not real scholars. They have their beholding to their universities and their huge salaries, which is another great thing about that. They assume we have these great salaries. They don't think they're making myths. They think the scholars, the academics are the ones making the myths. So they come up with these ideas and they put a lot of energy into it. They travel around, they look at things, and some of them even get stuff published. And so they feel that they're the ones telling the true story. Everything else is sort of some of them come out and say, well, they're lying.
Yeah.
There are these characters out of the Bible called the Nephilim, who were giants. There were giants in the earth in those days.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderfully sort of dotty belief within the outsider community. These giants are real, or were real, and the Smithsonian Institution has their remains, and they're hiding from everyone.
Because professional scholars are part of the establishment, and part of the whole cover-up.
Exactly. Where the professional academic scholarship is this hotbed of nefarious evildoers.
Right.
One of the things I love about that is all these people, if you go by the writings, they think the Smithsonian is the only museum in America. There are no other museums. It's just the Smithsonian, and it's a hive of bad guys who work for the government. And as soon as you work for the government, you're evil. And so that's why they're keeping all this from us.
Yeah, they don't want the people to know, because if the people know something new and different, then they have power in theory.
Right. If we knew that Carthaginians made it to Oklahoma, or that ancient Hebrews made it to Texas, or that Templars made it to Minnesota and Michigan, somehow the very fabric of reality would fall apart and the world would explode or something.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And as you say, it runs through all your work because you're looking at people of a similar stripe who look at Bigfoot and look at other things and totally discount scientific and scholarly research on them. But, I learned so much. I had known, for instance, we're going to talk about St. Brendan and I'm going to talk about the Viking theory and things like that. I had known about these things, but there were a lot of things I didn't know about. A lot of these theories I didn't know about, or some of them I only barely knew about. And I'd like to start, if you don't mind, by this after all, we've done these shows on Columbus and we want people to get your book, so we don't want to discuss every chapter, so we're going to leave your Legend of Christopher Columbus chapter as a tantalizing thought, so impetus to get the book. But if you don't mind, maybe we start with this fascinating archaeological thing right in the middle of America. These what you call the chapter you call the mound builders, and these are ancient archaeological mounds in Ohio and other places. Now, foreign buzzkillers won't know that Ohio in the Midwest is often thought by us East and West Coasters as boring and flat and suburban and all that stuff, but of course it's absolutely fascinating in its own right. Tell us the story of the mound builders and the ideas that people and the conclusions that people put on these mounds is absolutely gripping.
Right. Well, as you said, what happens is when European immigrants start showing up, they mostly congregate on the very eastern edge of the continent, or Boston, New York, Washington, Baltimore. But then people start moving inland, and you go the easiest route, which from the east is the Ohio River, then the Mississippi, and they start finding these mounds. Some of them are just sort of conically shaped dirt mounds. Some of them are stone constructions. One of the things that always annoys me about the way American history is done is that for most people, American history starts in 1492 when Columbus shows up. And that somehow there's nothing before that. That is just empty land with nobody around. Or that the native people, they weren't really builders. They just sort of lived in little hovels, and maybe they threw some skins over some sticks and that was it. But a number of the early American native groups were quite the architects, and they built all sorts of structures all along the river because human beings know that water is life. And so when you're going to build a city, you build it near water. And so they started building these structures. And then the people who build them, as often happens, they move away, and then Europeans come along and find these things. And the Europeans refused to believe, even European naturalists who should have known better, refused to believe that the native people could have built these.
Right.
And so they start coming up with all of these stories about these shadowy characters, the mound builders, that run the gamut from lost white races to almost supernatural figures to do this, because one of the things that European settlers simply refused to accept is that the Indians were here first, and that the Indians did some really cool stuff. They built cities. They built these mounds. They had complex social interaction and religion and all the things that make a civilization. And so you start to get all these stories about who did these things, and you get some really fascinating authors who start writing books about it. My two early favorites, the first guy is named William Pigeon, and he writes a book he calls it The Tradition of Dakota. And he tells the story about meeting this old Native American man. Of course, it's got to be a wise old man who imparts to him what's going on and the history of this. And it turns out later that Pigeon just made this character up. He's a literary construction. And then sometime later, you get Josiah Priest, who's also talking about the mounds, and where Pigeon was kind of paternalistic, Priest is outright racist.
Yeah.
Even anti-Semitic. And he writes a number of books about the mounds. He writes one book where he says that slavery is okay because Black people were meant to be slaves.
Right.
So that gives you an idea of where this guy's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start excavations, and you then get probably the two most scientific of these mound explorers, Ephraim Squire. Nobody names their kid Ephraim anymore.
Yeah, real tragedy.
Yeah, and William Davis. And they sort of take a much more scientific, or at least archaeological approach. They start measuring things and making careful drawings and maps. Squire, he's never really sure if he believes the Native Americans built these. He thinks they did. If you read his work, you almost can hear him fighting in his head whether or not to say, yes, it was Native Americans, or no, it was some other lost white race. They're always lost white races. They're never lost Black races. They're always lost white races.
And by the way, Buzzkillers, they say this in their writings. They are talking about literally lost white races, lost Caucasian races that came to the United States, or came to what became the United States, built all these things, and then disappeared for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Literally calling them that.
Right. I should have made it clear when I said lost white race, I mean literally lost white race. Caucasians who came here, who were smarter than everybody else. It's almost a kind of proto-Aryan theory, where Europeans, the Nazis in particular, they come up with the Aryan theory that Aryan people, blonde hair, blue-eyed, white Aryans, were the smartest people of all time, and they really build the world. And there's that idea that runs through it. And it doesn't go away. It's still there. There is a modern amateur named Graham Hancock who's made a ton of money by writing books about this sort of thing. He's been on TV shows. He has absolutely no training as an archaeologist, no training as a historian, no training as a linguist, but he thinks he's figured out that 10,000 years ago, there was this massive white race. He won't really come out and say Aryan. I think he's smart enough to stop just before that point. But this notion that light-skinned people taught all the dark-skinned people of the world how to build stuff. That anytime you see any kind of ancient monumental architecture, the locals couldn't have done it. They're not smart enough to have done it. They had to wait for others come and show them how to do these things.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is they're obvious, the mounds themselves, and by the way, Buzzkillers, calling them mounds is a little bit too dismissive. I mean, some of these things are huge. They look like the big Mesoamerican pyramid in Central America. And then there's also this serpent mound in Ohio, which from the air anyway, you can see was clearly designed to look like a serpent.
Right.
It's built in a certain way. So This isn't just let's build a mound as a place, I don't know, for fortification or whatever. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, there's a lot of engineering involved.
Yeah, and to make these logical backflips to say, well, it has to have been transplanted Egyptians is just a fascinating thing.
Yeah, with the Serpent Mound, just recently, say 2 years ago, some Christian fundamentalist organization shows up at the Serpent Mound because it's a tourist attraction, it's an archaeological site, it's taken care of to keep it the way it is. And they show up and they say, we're taking over here because Native Americans didn't build this, white people built this.
Yeah.
White Christians built it, so therefore we own it.
Yeah.
So this is in the 21st century, this is still going on.
Yeah, it's astounding. The discussion of this in popular and in somewhat serious journals and reviews in the 19th century is extensive. So lots of people, lots of the chattering classes read it and believe it. Is there a point at which enough people say, look, come on, we know this is not true. We know it has to be Native Americans because, and then they provide their own archaeological evidence. Is there sort of a crackpot exhaustion point beyond which people are not willing to believe these assumptions and these logical leaps and argue that it is Native Americans? After all, the Serpent Mound site now, the Welcome Center and then the Archaeological Center, talks about Native Americans doing this, apart from the Christians trying to cover it. I guess I'm asking, and sorry for the long, torturous way of doing it, when do people really see the light or realize the error of their ways in trying to ascribe this to anybody but Native Americans?
Unfortunately, I think there's no upper limit to crack pottery.
Okay.
I think I understand your question. It's towards the end of the 19th century, after the Civil War, that you start getting, there isn't like a sea change, but you're starting to get the growth of professional historians, the growth of professional archaeologists. One of the things that is part of this book is, and I hope it came across, was that the search for America's origins is not just the story of how do we find out who got here first? It's the story of the birth and the creation of the American scholarly academic world. Because prior to this, like all the guys I've mentioned so far, and women don't become part of this till later on, none of them have any academic training. They're all amateur historians, amateur archaeologists. Some of them are quite good. Cyrus Thomas, for example, who was kind of what we might call the hero of that middle period in the mounds, who gets to work for, of course, the Smithsonian, so you can't trust him. He comes out and he says, look, the evidence is pretty clear. The native people, current native people, or their ancestors, they're the ones who built these mounds. But even he's not really a trained archaeologist. He sort of gets a job with the Smithsonian as a teenager. And he works his way up the ladder and he studies a lot, genuinely really smart, and is one of the good guys of the period. But you don't start to really see the kind of rejection of the really off-the-wall stuff like Josiah Priest and William Pidgeon and all that until the end of the 19th century.
That's amazing. That's just amazing. Well, buzzkillers, please, especially Ohio buzzkillers, go see these things if you haven't. I mean, they are amazing, and it's an eye-opening look at the sophistication of North America and North American cultures at the time. But what then intrigued me so much as we move on to the next chapter in the book which is about Saint Brendan, the Irish saint and monk who traveled a lot, is that there seems to be arising in the United States a need for specific ethnic groups, Irish Americans, Italian Americans with Columbus, particularly Protestant Americans, when we talk about Scandinavians, that they want their countrymen to have been one of their countrymen to have been the person. They don't want Columbus because he's Catholic. Some of them don't want Columbus because he's Catholic. Some of them don't want Columbus because he's Italian. So almost as if Irish Americans latch onto or reach for. There must have been a time when Saint Brendan got here. Again, sorry, buzzkillers. I'm just so taken by this book. I'm running over myself trying to formulate these questions. But Saint Brendan stories.
You keep talking it up. It sounds great.
No.
I can't disagree.
The St. Brendan story is fascinating in itself, but it also brings up these notions of 19th and early 20th century Irish America and Irish American pride and the extent to which people will go to claim things that there's no evidence for.
If we take all these stories and forget that they're stories and legends and put them in chronological order as supporters say they occurred, Brendan is one of the very first. And he's a monk, St. Brendan, Irish monk. The story says that he encountered another monk one day who tells him about there's this land far off the west, off the ocean, that God had created as a place for the saints to live. Brendan decides he's going to go find this. And it's almost like a bunch of frat boys get a car, fill the trunk full of beer, and head off to Vegas. We heard of this place.
Yeah.
Let's go. They all pack in and they head off and have an adventure. And a lot of these stories are like that.
A lot of them involve this mystical West.
Right.
The West. And so Vegas is the perfect match.
And of course, they go and they ruin everything. Brendan gets a couple of his monk buddies and they make a little boat and they fill some supplies and they head off west. It's always west from Europe. And at what point they find an island, a little island. And you decide, you've been rowing forever, let's land on this island. We'll hang out there a little while, we'll rest, and then we'll get back in the boat and head off again. And so they do that. And then they realize the island is moving and the island is raising up. And it turns out they've made a camp on the back of a whale.
Right. Yeah.
And so that kind of freaks them out a little bit. And then they get back in their boat and they find land. They get onto the beach. Some guy comes walking along out of nowhere. Not a native person, sort of Europeanish person. And Brennan says, well, where are we? And he says, oh, you're in the land of the saints. Brennan's all happy. But to me, the weird thing is that they go through all this trouble. They finally get to this place, discover it's the place that they wanted to get to. And then after 5 minutes, they jump back in the boat and they go home.
Yeah, that is very odd. I don't think they ever really leave the beach area, do they?
Not as far as I can tell. It's like the frat boys show up in Vegas, but all they do is they drive up and down the strip, looking out the window of the car. And they said, okay, we've been to Vegas. And they turn around and go home.
Yeah.
And so obviously, one of the problems with these stories is they seem superficially detailed, but they're not. And so it's not until years later that this guy named John Dee, famous British magician, alchemist, mathematician, close friend of Elizabeth I, he's trying to get Elizabeth I, Ginger Liz, he's trying to get her to say, because people know that Columbus has been there, John Cabot's been here. John Dee thinks that Elizabeth should lay claim to North America. And he uses the story of Brendan as an example that somebody from the British Isles were the first ones here. He'll also throw in the story of Prince Madoc, who was Welsh. It's thought that Dee is the first person to use the term British Empire. So they want to grab this because they see that Spain and Portugal, they're gobbling up huge chunks of Central and South America. And if we don't get in on this deal, we're going to miss out on it and we'll never have a foothold in the New World. And so Dee uses Brendan and Madoc and basically makes up the story that, even though it's not really clear in the original writing, all these things come from text. They start off as oral tales and then they start getting written down as manuscripts.
And 1,000 things can be changed and added in that process.
Of course. And so Dee is the one who kind of connects rather tortuously Brendan and Madoc with discovering America, because that way, if we say that, if we accept that, then we have a legitimate claim to say England owns North America.
Even though in theory, it could be saying Ireland owns it. But of course, Elizabethan Ireland by this time was largely in control of the crown.
One of the useful things about Brendan is that he really was a traveler.
Yeah.
He travels to the Faroe Islands, all those really cold, inhospitable islands, kind of north of the British Isles. He travels around. And so to say that, oh, he also did this, it sounds plausible.
Yeah, and I suppose an Elizabethan looking at a map of the Northern Atlantic thinks, well, Iceland isn't that far away, and Greenland isn't that far away from Iceland, and North America isn't that far away from Greenland, so sure, Brendan could have done it. Maybe the beach he landed on was Nantucket Beach, what eventually became Nantucket Beach.
Right.
But also this becomes a big deal for the Irish-American community later in the 19th century.
Sure, and Madoc, too, for the Welsh.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
There's so much fascinating about all this. One of the things I find interesting and telling is that these different characters who get put forward as the true discoverers of America, their biggest supporters are from that same ethnic group.
Right.
So the Welsh love the story of Prince Madoc discovering America, and the Irish love the story of St. Brendan. And Scandinavians love the story of Leif Erikson. African Americans have embraced the story of Abu Bakr. About the only group that doesn't fall within that is the Asia theory, where Chinese people come over. As far as I can tell, if there's anybody listening who knows better, please let me know. I'd love to hear about it. But the biggest supporters of the Asia theory of American discovery are Caucasian American rather than Asian Americans.
Fascinating.
But everybody else, it's our guy is from, this guy's from where we are. We're going to support him.
Yeah, it's a very strong strain of nationalism,
right,
in the 19th century to early 20th century. Even till today, there are all sorts of clubs, for instance, of ethnic origin that promote these things. But you mentioned then Leif Erikson, and we're on now to perhaps the real biggie, the one that lots of people believe, and that is, of course, the Viking theory. And there are so many things that are fascinating in this chapter. One of the things I love the most, because I'm a Victorian historian, is the Victorian mania for all things Viking and Scandinavian. But please, tell us the Leif Erikson story and the Scandinavian story and the Viking story from, if you will, the beginning.
Sure. In the 21st century, the first historiographic issue we run into with the Viking theory is that there's two of them. There's the fantasy Viking theory, and then there's the reality Viking theory. The reality, I'll do the reality quickly and then get on to the more fun bit. We now know that Scandinavian people did come to North America 500 years before Columbus.
Yeah.
There are archaeological sites that have been long since confirmed, first discovered in the 1960s, a place called Lanso Meadow, that were clearly sites done by Scandinavian people. Artifacts have been found. Houses have been found, and there really isn't much controversy about that. This one site, at least, probably more, was created by people out of Scandinavia. Now, the term Viking is yet another historiographic problem. You just run into these issues. Every time you think you've cracked one thing, another one gets thrown in your face that muddies the waters. The concept of Vikings that most people think of when they hear the word, big burly guys with fur and the helmets with the horns on and all that, that's a bit misleading. There were Scandinavian pirates who terrorized Northern Europe, the British Isles, made it all the way down into the Middle East, terrorized the Islamic world for a while. They're probably the greatest travelers, explorers of the period, but they were not a homogeneous group. They were fairly multi-ethnic, which makes European white supremacists really angry because they want to see Vikings as these pure white people, and it just wasn't the case.
Yeah, and it's supposed to fit in with the Aryan narrative.
Right, exactly. That's the reality. That's the real Vikings discovered America bit. Then there's the other one. That's the one with Leif Erikson. And we know this story from a single medieval Icelandic manuscript called the Vinland Sagas. And the story says that a guy named Eric the Red, he leaves Denmark, he goes to Iceland, sets up a homestead. Then he kills a guy. They always say manslaughter. My knowledge of Scandinavian jurisprudence isn't what it should be. I'm just going to go with the original term manslaughter. Okay. But he kills a guy because the guy he kills one of his slaves. And so he kills the guy who killed his slave. Now, when we get to the United States and Leif Erikson mania there, supporters of that will try to make the Vikings who come to North America out to be these proto-democratic Republicans. We're looking for freedom, true freedom. We're going to leave the evils of the old Catholic world behind, and we're going to create something new and full of liberty and justice for all. Meanwhile, the people who are touting as this were slavers.
Yeah, absolutely.
He kills a guy, and so he wants to leave Iceland. And he knows that there's land north of Iceland. He goes there and he finds this big place, and he basically creates a real estate deal.
Yeah.
Come to this place, cheap land, good for farming. And despite the fact that it's really cold and snowy, in a genius public relations move, he calls it Greenland.
Right.
And come to Greenland, come to Florida and buy some swampland, come to Greenland for a future of freedom and whatever wonderful thing you want, you can find it in Greenland. And so settlements start. And Eric has a couple of kids. He's got a boy, that's Leif. He's got a daughter, that's Freydis. He brings the family, and they start a settlement, and some other people are coming over. And then one of Leif's friends wants to follow them and start a farmstead there. And so he gets in his longboat, his Viking longboat, with some other pals and some supplies, and they're going to go to Greenland. But they get lost, and they wind up heading west, and they see land west of Greenland, but they don't actually go near it. They're trying to get to Greenland, but they see it, then they turn around, and they finally make it to Greenland. They make it to the settlements and all, so everything's fine. So he goes to Greenland, meets everybody, And this guy's name is Barney Herlufsen.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this because if the story is true, and again, all this comes out of one little medieval manuscript. If this story is accurate, which it probably isn't, but if it's accurate, I love the idea that the first European to see mainland America was named Barney. That just kind of tickles me for some reason. So he meets up with everybody and he's like, there's land over here. So Leif decides he's going to go exploring. So Leif and a bunch of his friends, they get in their boat and they head over and they get to the land. The first place they go isn't that nice. It's kind of cold and icy and rocky. They head south some more, find another place, which is a little bit nicer, but still kind of like Goldilocks in the porridge. And he finally gets to a place that's really nice, green and lush, and the weather's not too bad. And because apparently there are vines growing everywhere, he calls it Vinland.
Right.
And he starts a settlement. And the whole thing starts off with this wonderfully comic scene where Leif's godfather, a guy named Tyrker, he wanders away from, they show up, they land on, and they're looking at Tyrker wanders off and gets lost. Everybody's freaking out. We got to find him. We got to find him. They're searching everywhere. They finally find him. He's asleep under a tree, drunk off of his ass.
Yeah.
Because apparently, according to the Vinland sagas, he's been eating these grapes off these vines. And so everybody happy they didn't lose him. So they start building a settlement. Then they start encountering the native people. Sometime later, it might be an apocryphal addition to the story, but at some point, the Scandinavians start referring to the native people as Skraelings. And at first, they kind of get along, but eventually it all heads south and they start having violent run-ins with each other. At one point, the Skraelings attack the Vikings with a catapult.
Very sophisticated weapon.
Yeah,
at that time.
Very sophisticated weapon, relatively speaking, and they're firing rocks at the Vikings, and the Vikings turn around and run away. Mm-hmm. And so Leif's sister, Freydis, is there in the midst of all this. Freydis is interesting because she's the first non-native female mentioned anywhere in any writings about the Americas. And the other thing which makes her interesting is she's a homicidal maniac.
Yeah.
She starts getting mad because the Vikings are running away from the Skraelings who are pitching rocks at them with their catapult. She undresses. She's now nude. She picks up a giant sword and she runs after the native people, waving this giant Viking sword in the air and presumably screaming at them and yelling at them. And the native people feel, who's this crazy white woman? And they run off. But then she turns around and she starts berating the Viking men for being cowards.
Yeah.
There's another, to give you an idea of what she's like. She wants to take over. She wants to be the queen of Vinland. She's married to this sort of milquetoasty guy who doesn't live up to her expectations. And she's got some followers, and there's another group of followers of people who are not her followers. And she thinks this other group is trying to keep her from taking over as the queen of Vinland. And so she tells her male followers, they're all sleeping in this hut over here. Go in there and kill them all. So they go in, screams, hacking sounds. They come out. Okay, we did it. And she says, did you kill everybody? Well, we killed all the men. Well, why didn't you kill everybody? Well, we don't kill women. We killed the men. She gets mad. Again, she grabs a sword or an axe or something. She charges back in there and hacks all the women to death.
Yeah.
Without blinking an eye.
Yeah.
This is the other Viking story. Eventually, the Norse people leave North America. They go back to Greenland. They even leave Greenland. They wind up going back to Iceland. And so after a while, the whole thing goes extinct and is only remembered.
The story does.
Yeah. And is only remembered in this one text, the Vinland Sagas. And that's what is going to, when the Vinland Sagas get rediscovered by Americans in the early 19th century, that's what is going to break open this whole fascination with Vikings, and Leif Erikson discovered America.
And then that brings us back to where we started the show, and which is a good way to end it. It just brings us back to this Viking mania of, as we said, Professor Eben Norton Horsford, and I'm going to say that name for the rest of my life now because it's so fabulous. It really goes all off the deep end, trying to prove all this stuff and do all his own Indiana Jones-esque research in the late 1800s. It's an amazing amount of work. I suppose he had the time and the money because of his patents for baking powder and stuff like that. But the fact that this gripped him so much, is it because there's this idea in what is now becoming increasingly Catholic Boston that we need to find a Protestant ethnic group as the origin story rather than the Catholic Columbus, or is there a lot more to it than that?
No, I think that's a big part of it. Horsford and some of the other people jump on the Leif Erikson bandwagon. This is at a time in post-Civil War.
Yeah.
You get the next big wave of immigrants coming in who are mostly not Protestant. They're mostly Catholics, Irish, Italian, and the Boston Brahmin hierarchy is really bothered by this. And so when Horsford gets hooked up with this story, he lives in Cambridge, and this is like the really wealthy part of town, and he's a next door neighbor to, his name just flew out of my head, Longfellow.
Yeah.
And who's written the Song of
the great American poet.
And all these, he's really well known. He's very wealthy. And Longfellow knows this Norwegian musician named Ole Bull, who is, people jokingly say, is the most famous Norwegian in the world. He would tour. He was a violinist, apparently a really good violinist who would not just play music. He was like Springsteen. He would do part of a song, then in the middle of it, he'd tell a story and then come back to the song again. So he was really popular, and he's this gadfly who latches on to famous people, and he's staying with Longfellow, and it's through Longfellow that Eben Norton Horsford, the chemist from Harvard, meets all of them, and they all start talking about Leif Erikson, and Horsford is just hooked. He basically gives up his scientific career, pursue this idea of proving that Leif Erikson not only discovered America, but lived in Boston.
Yeah.
So it worked out kind of nice that way. Leif's house was right down the street from Horsford's house, and he does some excavations. Well, he doesn't. He hires people because Horsford's got a lot of money. He's got all these food patents. He marries into the Gardner family, the famous wealthy art family of Boston. And so he's got tons of dough, and he publishes a whole series of these magnificently produced tomes with the fine green leather covers and the gold leaf and beautiful fold-out maps of a kind that book publishers simply won't do anymore. He sends these things around, and he finds a reference to a story of a lost North American city called Norumbega.
Right.
North America doesn't have a lot of lost city legends, but Norumbega is one of them. Through his consultation of rare books and hard to find, one-of-a-kind maps, he sets up a library in his house with the mellow bookshelves and the $1 million worth of rare books in there and maps and things. And he comes to the conclusion, two conclusions. First, that Leif Erikson does discover America, but he does it by coming through what will become Boston.
Yeah, which is much further south than you would think, because south and west, the northeastern stretches where the Scandinavians probably did land in the real story.
Right. He decides that Leif Erikson, not only did he discover America, he built a house for himself, Leif did, on the Charles River, which is the big river that runs through Boston. And the other thing he decides is that a little bit south of where Leif's house was, that is where Norumbega was. So there's this huge Xanadu-like, El Dorado-like city just off of the Charles River, which is also where Leif Erikson built a house, which is kind of nice because it's basically a short carriage ride from Eben Norton Horsford's home.
Right. This also enhances the idea of Boston being the dominant city in the country. And if you're Horsford, you already believe that.
Right. And a lot of the big civic leaders in Boston, who are all rich Protestants, who are all horrified by this influx of rude, guttural Italians and Irish Catholics, want to do something to try to reclaim their, their power, their philosophical control of Boston. And so Horsford decides to put up a statue to Leif Erikson.
Yeah.
To show everybody, all you grunts, you see this guy, that shows you that white Protestants own this place, not you out of control Catholics. And so they put up a statue, which is still there. You can still see it. It's still sitting in the place that it was put. The original design was going to be very Viking. Helmet with the horns and the big bulgy muscles and this giants, all that. But that first attempt fails. And so Horsford gets a second shot, and he has a woman sculptor who he knew do the statue. And they put it up and they had this huge unveiling. The Irish mayor of Boston is there to pull the string to have the cloak come off the statue. And they got a band playing patriotic music. And people see this thing for the first time. It's not exactly a portrait of a virile alpha male. The figure is kind of lithe, almost feminine. He doesn't have the giant furs on. He's wearing a helmet, but it doesn't have the horns. Rather than portraying Leif as this out-of-control berserker, he's a much more thoughtful explorer. The tongues were wagging, let's say, in the Boston press when this thing gets unveiled. Some people said that the woman who designed it used herself as the model.
Ouch. Yeah.
She was a well-known sculptor, teacher, also a lesbian who long-term relationship with another woman. They make this thing. And so that is the fantasy version of the Viking discover America thing.
What's so fascinating about this, the extents to which they go. You just don't build statues just on a whim. You don't go making archaeological digs in the center of Cambridge just on a whim. This gets back to your original point. These people are really dyed-in-the-wool believers. And I just wonder, as a way of wrapping up, a lot of Americans recently, Tom Nichols and other people recently, I mean, the last 5 years, are talking about the death of expertise. And, we have all these conspiracy theories and we have all these stories and all this junk going on out there. Well, this sort of stuff makes me wonder whether this hasn't sort of always been the case, that we don't really listen to experts unless it's our medical doctor telling us we're about to die or something. We come up with a concept first that's romantic and is what we want based on our ethnicity or our religion or whatever, our belief in European superiority, and then we dash around making all sorts of tenuous connections to various, quote, facts, unquote. We start with an ideology and then try to find the facts to fit it rather than the other way around. So has expertise in this sense in America always been dead or ignored or not given the attention it should be given?
Well, I think if you look at American history, we have this almost schizophrenic approach to knowledge.
Yeah.
And there was this whole thing early on, people have to be educated. And it's you're doing a patriotic thing by going to college and becoming smart and becoming an expert in some field. But at the same time, we deeply distrust expertise unless they're telling us something we want to hear. And what happens is you have all these over a dozen different legends and myths, and the outsider community rejects the academics because the academics are saying, well, wait, there's no evidence for any of this. When Horsford starts publishing his books, there's this famous, he's not really that famous anymore, unfortunately, he should be, Boston historian named Justin Windsor, probably the first real serious professional historian in America and trained as a historian. He's not just picks it up as an amateur. He's a trained historian. And he goes through Horsford's stuff and I mean, just eviscerates it.
Yeah.
Call the cops. There was just a murder here. Horsford asks him to come and see one of these sites because he thinks if Justin Windsor says this is real, that I'm in. It's done.
Yeah, right.
And Justin Windsor comes out. He says, okay, I'll come out and I'll take a look at it. And he looks at this and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. There are no archaeological remains here. He starts saying, well, the Scandinavians of the period you're talking about, they didn't do this. They didn't do that. Their settlements look like this. This looks nothing like actual Norse settlements because by then, back in Scandinavia, you have this rebirth or birth of scholarly interest in Scandinavian history. And they're all running around and doing excavations and they're the first ones to sort of question this whole idea of what a Viking even is. They can read the original documents. Horsford can't read anything. He can't read any of the original documents. He has to read translations. So he's missing all the subtleties and nuance of the way the stories are being told. And the people who actually know what they're talking about all look at this and say, it's a fun idea and all. There's no reason to think that Scandinavians couldn't make it here, but there's no evidence that they did.
Well, and that's one of the key things we keep talking about on the show is that there has to be evidence for something happening.
Right.
If there's no evidence, we can't say for certain that something happened. And even though people like to believe that, I love this idea of the schizophrenic approach to knowledge. There's a one side that that hates expertise and the other side that requires it. Well, I think also one of the ways in which people can try to fight against this death of expertise or the continuing is to read books like yours. You say you could have written a 10-volume series on this, but it really, in one volume, is a very comprehensive look at the major theories, but also why they happened and why they became so almost necessary for these people's emotional life. They needed to have a Protestant or proto-Protestant founder of America. They needed to have an anti-Catholic, or they needed to have non-Native American discoverers of what eventually became the United States. So it just remains for me, again, to insist, Buzzkillers, you go to the Buzzkill bookshelf, get this book, The Battle Over America's Origin Story, Legends, Amateurs, and Professional Historiographers, and to thank you, Dr. Regal, for coming on the show. It's been great.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being had.
We'll hope you'll come back and talk about Bigfoot and all kinds of other stuff, and especially talk about the new stuff that you're doing.
Great.
So Buzzkillers, again, go to the Buzzkill Bookshelf, go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com and do all the stuff you do there, and we'll talk to all of you next week.